Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the UNC School of Medicine, I welcome and thank you all for joining us for this annual Norma Berryhill Distinguished Lectureship. I'm Bill Roper, Dean of the school, and it's a personal privilege and pleasure to welcome all of you to this occasion that means so much to our school and to the university and the community. There are a number of distinguished visitors here, many more than I can reasonably recognize, but I want to note a few, please. My distinguished predecessors, Dr. Stuart Bondurant and Dr. Jeffrey Haupt, former deans of the School of Medicine, former Chancellor Paul Hardin, former chair of the Board of Trustees, Roger Perry, now member of the board of the healthcare system. This is a special occasion that recognizes what the UNC School of Medicine family is all about. And in remembering that, I thought earlier this afternoon about this morning. Many of us were in Memorial Hall for a very special program recognizing the life and legacy of Bill Friday. And much was said about Mr. Friday, as it should have been, but also a lot was said about what a special place this university is and this community that binds us together. And that's in part what this Berryhill lectureship is all about. The people additionally that I'd like to recognize are the former Berryhill lecturers. And if I could ask each of you, or if you're a family member of a former Berryhill lecturer, would you please stand so we can recognize you, please? Thank you. This event has always been a high point in the School of Medicine year. It's become our fall convocation. It's a time for us to formally start the year and reaffirm our commitment to scholarship, to our students, our faculty, and to the spirit of collegiality that the Berryhills left as a legacy to all of us. As many of you know, this lectureship recognizes a very individual, who's a cherished individual, Norma Berryhill, who along with her distinguished husband, Dr. Walter Reese Berryhill, contributed immeasurably to the development of this institution, to the recruitment of an outstanding faculty, and to the enhancement of the ambiance that characterizes Chapel Hill. Indeed, Norma and Reese Berryhill hold an exalted place in our School of Medicine history. Reese for his monumental accomplishments as medical school dean from 1940 to 64, that's 24 years, which included the expansion of the medical school and the building of the North Carolina Memorial Hospital. And Norma, his partner, for her love, loyalty, quiet wisdom, and support. She was described as a principal architect and engineer for the School of Medicine and the Medical Center, and she nurtured generations of students and provided guidance and wisdom for all the deans, and for this we're tremendously grateful. Please join me in expressing our gratitude for all that the Berryhill family have done for us. I regret to tell you that Mrs. Catherine Berryhill Williams is not able to be with us tonight, but we remember her as well. Let me acknowledge our speakers' family who are with us, Carol Orringer, Jean and Carol's daughters, Jamie, Lisa, Christy, and their husbands, Jean's sister and his brother-in-law, Millie and Michael Rose. Could I ask all of you to stand, please, so we can recognize you? Thank you. And now let me call on Dr. Rick Wharf of Winston-Salem, who's president of the UNC Medical Alumni Association.
Good evening. I am Rick Wharf, and it has been an honor and a privilege to serve as president of the Medical Alumni Association this year. This is a really fun job. I get to come to Chapel Hill more than I usually do, and it's always fun to make that trip and visit this beautiful place. I also get to hang out with really great people who work hard every day to advance the mission of this medical school and this university as a whole. I want to encourage any present alumni or future alumni in the room to support actively the business of the Alumni Association and Dr. Fowler, who recently ably took over the reins of leadership after the retirement of our equally able leader, Dr. Harper, and they're both in the room tonight. My office affords me the privilege of welcoming everyone to this celebration of one of the most notable faculty members. We get to do this every year, and it also allows us on an annual basis, as the Dean mentioned, to recognize the contribution of Mrs. Norma Berryhill to the development of our school. The Berryhills ushered us through the process of converting from a 2-year to a 4-year fully accredited medical school. We owe this wonderful couple more than we can ever repay for getting us all off on the right foot. I wasn't of the generation that got to personally know the Berryhills, but I did get the benefit of inspired instruction from Dr. Eugene Orringer. I am sure Dr. Orringer got to spend more than his fair share of time with medical students in his position as a junior faculty member at the time. He was a model for students, house staff, and others pretty much from the time he arrived here in 1969. One thing I remember about Dr. Orringer is that somehow he had a really good seat in Carmichael. It was courtside. Now, I knew he was a smart guy, and I knew him as a mentor to students and house staff on the wards and in the classrooms at the medical school. But on more than one occasion, I also saw him mentor a few ACC refs during Carolina home basketball games. So I'm looking forward to his remarks on mentoring tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the evening, Dr. Gene Orringer. Gene is professor of medicine and director of the MD PhD program here, and he is also director of the Education, Training, and Career Development Core of the North Carolina Translational and Clinical Sciences Institute, the TRACS Institute. Gene came here to UNC after finishing his MD degree at Pittsburgh, and he completed his internal medicine and hematology training here in 1975 and joined the Parker Lab, where his research focused on membrane transport properties of the human erythrocyte and its role in various pathologic states, particularly sickle cell disease. He went on to establish and became director of the UNC Comprehensive Sickle Cell Program. In NIH-funded studies, Gene and his group were able to demonstrate how hydroxyurea reduced the frequency and severity of the painful episodes experienced by sickle cell patients. This drug is the first and the only drug that the FDA has approved for treating sickle cell disease. In partnership with Drs. Wendell Ross and Marilyn Thielen at Duke, Gene helped establish and then directed the Duke UNC Comprehensive Sickle Cell Center, one of the very first examples of collaboration between our two universities. Gene has also served as program director of the General Clinical Research Center, increasing its productivity and quality, and he was elected president of the GCRC Directors Association nationally. Gene was also involved in translational research, and he took a leadership role in the work that led to the TRACS Institute here at UNC. This program, funded by the NIH, enables us to be one of 60 universities in the U.S. working together to promote translational research and train the next generation of clinical researchers. He also leads ably our MD PhD program. When he took it over, it had 12 students in 1995, and today it has 75 students. Data from the NIH indicate that students in our program have experienced greater success in competing for their own independent grant support than MD PhD students at any other school in the country. And I'm sure you're going to hear that again tonight because Gene has told me that innumerable times. From recruiting to selection of laboratory rotations to selection of theses advisors to keeping track of each individual, Gene has supplied the energy and the glue and the ethos of the program, as someone has said. In 1999, at Dr. Haupt's request, Gene became Executive Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs and Faculty Development for the medical school. He and his colleagues secured numerous federal grants to create a number of junior faculty development and training programs. Again, as Gene, I'm sure, will tell you, we have more of those programs than does any other medical school in the country. The Birch program focusing on women and minority students, the Minority Faculty Development Program, also now known as the Simmons Scholar Program, and on and on. Gene's mentoring of students and faculty in the School of Medicine is really legendary, and his contributions in this area extend to other health science schools here at UNC, as represented by Dr. Bob Lewin, Dean of Pharmacy, being with us tonight. The programs of faculty support that Gene has created and his philosophy and style of mentoring have been adopted by institutions literally all across the country. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our 2012 Berryhill lecturer, Dr. Gene Orringer.
Thank you for that terrific introduction. In fact, you've given a fair amount of my talk already. I can't tell you what an honor it is today to be here and to be in front of so many friends and faculty members and colleagues. I'm deeply, deeply honored, and I thank you all for the opportunity to give this Berryhill lecture. Now, if this will work, and I'm guaranteed that it will, right? Ha! I'd be remiss if I first didn't recognize our pianist for today. This is Tony Law. Tony is one of our MD PhD students who recently completed his PhD in biochemistry and will receive his MD later on this spring. After completing his undergraduate work at Hopkins, it may not surprise you to know that Tony spent 2 years at the conservatory, the State Conservatory in Florence, Italy, studying piano. So we had to take advantage of him here. Next, just a word about the Berryhill Lectureship. As you know, this was originally established in 1985 and has been delivered each year since. It's named in honor of Mrs. Berryhill, who, along with Reese, her husband, contributed so greatly to the development of our school. Indeed, it's Mrs. Berryhill herself who is often credited with the development of the culture of collegiality and collaboration that is such an important part of the fabric of this institution. Dean Bondurant, who's here somewhere, is actually the driving force behind this lectureship. It was his vision that this annual lecture would do two things. One, it would, in perpetuity, remind us of our roots. 60 years ago, this became a 4-year school, largely because of the Berryhills. And second, it would provide an opportunity for us to honor a senior member of the faculty. Please be assured that I am very honored to be here, and I'm actually humbled to be this year's Berryhill lecturer. In fact, I've spent a good part of the last month or so reading everybody else's Berryhill lecture, and let me tell you that I sincerely hope I can live up to, or at least stay on the same podium with those remarkable people. So again, thank you, Berryhill Lecture Committee, for picking me. It's next my privilege to acknowledge my family. First, my wife Carol and I, and here's Carol. Oops, I didn't see, I knew I was going to do something wrong. There. I'm hitting the wrong thing. Forget that. Anyway, that's Carol there. Carol and I have been blessed with 3 of the best daughters that anyone could possibly hope for. Our oldest daughter is Delisa. I'll try one time. What am I doing wrong? Which is the thing? The top one or this one?
The middle one.
That's the
Top and right.
Ah, no wonder. If you push the right button, it works. So this is Lisa up here with her family, and on either side are her younger identical twin sisters, Christy on the right and Jamie on the left, and all of their families. And together, this is our whole family. We all live here in Chapel Hill. The furthest one lives 4 miles away from the others. We are as close as a family could be. I can't tell you how happy it is for me to have them here to share this wonderful event with me. Finally, I have to say a word about Carol, my dear wife, who's had the patience of Job listening to this lecture over and over again. I have no doubt that no one in the room is happier that this day is here than Carol. Now, let's go backwards too. Yeah. So you can tell that Carol and I both have dark hair and dark eyes, and it doesn't surprise you that each of our kids, we don't have any blonde-haired, blue-eyed girls. We just don't have them. And that's because they're a product of their genes, right? So everybody is a product of their genes, their families, and their environment, and you frankly don't have much say in that. I mean, that is what it is. On the other hand, what we ultimately become is also driven and greatly influenced by whom we select as our mentors, our role models, and our friends. And we do have a substantial say in that. And that's kind of what this talk is going to be about, is how important it is to select the right mentors. So the word mentor goes back to Greek mythology. And you can see here, this is mentor. And this is Telemachus. Now, Mentor was a close friend of Odysseus, and when he set out to fight the Trojan War, he entrusted his beloved son, Telemachus, to Mentor, asking him that he educate this young man. And so that's really where it came from. And when I talk about mentoring, what I talk about today is an interaction between a more mature, more experienced person and someone who is less so. Typically, the mentor is more mature and older. The mentee is generally younger. But in any event, the mentoring process provides guidance to those mentees so that they can, in turn, take some form of action. So who is a mentor? Well, typically mentors are teachers. They may be a counselor, a friend, or even a family member. But in any case, a good mentor provides advice and lends expertise to his or her mentees so that they'll first gain new knowledge, they'll advance their careers, they'll build their networks, and finally they'll make important life decisions. And what I'll try and show you, using my career as an example, is how my mentors did all of these things for me. It's impossible to overstate the importance of a good mentor. He or she can be profound, the influence can be profound, long-lasting, and in many cases, permanent. Now I want to contrast for a moment mentors with role models, because they're quite different. When I think of a role model, this is simply somebody who sets a good example for others. Typically, a role model possesses qualities that we would like to have in ourselves, qualities that makes us want to be better people. While mentors, as I said, are generally older, that's not necessarily the case for role models. In fact, many cases, role models can be younger. Also, unlike mentors, role models are generally unaware that they're serving in that role. And lastly, of course, many mentors can, in fact, themselves be role models, and I'll show you some examples of that. What I'd like to do first is to show you a few examples of people who are role models for me throughout my career. So this is somebody I'm sure many of you recognize. This is my good friend Francis Collins. Here's Francis in 1981 when he was a chief medical resident at UNC. Even at that time, he was smarter than any of us. And here he is 30 years later as the director of the NIH, and we were at a meeting together. The reason I think of Francis as a role model is that he had a very strong altruistic streak in himself. Francis, for years and years, went to underdeveloped countries in Africa and spent a couple of weeks taking care of poor and underserved people who otherwise wouldn't be getting care. And I thought that was such a phenomenal thing. Here's another role model. In fact, this role model's here in the room. He doesn't know, I'm sure, that he was a role model for me, but he was. This is a fellow named Roger Grecken, and Roger is a professor of endocrinology at the University of Michigan. He and I were roommates together when we were undergraduates in Ann Arbor. He recently received the Lifetime Achievement Award in Medical Education, which said in part, his commitment to the standards of excellence and his effects on the teaching experience of Michigan medical students during the past quarter century has been absolutely remarkable. So why was Roger a role model? Well, Roger always did the right thing, you know? I mean, we were in a fraternity, and most of us didn't do the right thing all the time, but Roger did. So I give you one example. If we would go to a movie, you know, when there's a line halfway around the block on State Street, most of us would try to find one of our friends up at the front of the line and get him to buy tickets on. Not Roger. Roger went to the end of the line. And the reason he did that is because it was the right thing to do. And I learned that from Roger. Here's another role model, and he's also here too, and this is a fellow named Chuck Kohler. So Chuck is at the Leukemia Center at MD Anderson, but I got to know him when he was an intern here at UNC, and I was a fellow in hematology with Dr. Roberts, who I see here. Harold, it's good to see you. And Chuck, there were several things about Chuck. First of all, he was a vegetarian. I didn't know that anybody just ate vegetables. I didn't know that existed. That was long before being a vegetarian was trendy. Now I have a future nephew who's a vegan, and my niece is a vegan, and it's very different today. But back then, only Chuck. But Chuck is among the most caring and compassionate physicians I've ever known. In fact, I've referred to him probably a dozen patients over my career, and they go down to MD Anderson, and they see Chuck, and they come back, and not only do they rave about what a wonderful doc he is, I realize that I can never live up to this again. So I wondered, could I keep sending patients there or not? But I do, because he's so terrific. Here's a picture of Chuck down here with the Houston Police Department and some of his little friends. He, every year, helps them organize a 2,500-mile bicycle ride that he runs as a fundraiser for the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. And Chuck, as I say, is an absolutely wonderful role model. And the last person needs no introduction to this crowd. I hope he's here. If he's not, he will be here soon, and you can tell. There he is. So this is Andrew, and I'm sure nobody in this room needs me to explain when I say he is a physician's physician. He's also a teacher's teacher and a true gentleman in every sense of the word. So these are the kind of people who I adopted as my role models. But this is sort of the outline of my talk, and let me just say a few things. When I planned this lecture, I soon realized that I've enjoyed some success here, and Bill nicely spelled out some of the things. I wish my mother were here to hear all those things, but much of what I've been able to accomplish has been dependent upon a very large number of remarkable people. They were my mentors, my collaborators, my students, my friends, and the people who worked with or for me. Without all of these individuals, many of the accomplishments that I've received credit for simply would have never happened. Therefore, I ask for your indulgence as I look back on a few of the highlights of each of these 4 decades. You know, I was a physician, an investigator, a program director, an associate dean. And with each highlight, I'll do my best to give credit to those individuals to whom it's rightly due. Obviously, I can't acknowledge everyone. I've been here much too long, and there are too many people. But I have tried to recognize many of the key people. To those of you who are here who I failed to acknowledge and should have, please let me thank you in advance. You are really important to me. But anyway, so that's my introduction, and now I'm going to start with my little talk. And this is the outline, and I'm going to start up here. And the last slide, I think I called it a long and winding road, and that's really what it's been. And I'm going to start with a prologue, and the prologue tells you how I got here in the first place, and then I'll look at each of these decades, and then I'll finish with a brief epilogue. So how did I get here? Well, so the story starts back with a fellow whose name is Soma Weiss. And I don't know if anybody here knows who Soma Weiss is. I never had the good fortune to meet him because he died in 1941, and I was born in 1943. So you may wonder, how did he influence me? Well, I'll tell you the story. So he was a Hungarian emigre. He came here as a young man, went to medical school at Cornell, and then moved to Harvard, where at the Thorndike, he began an absolutely meteoric career. Ultimately, this culminated when he became the chair of medicine at the Brigham in 1939. He was described by everyone as the best clinician, an inspiring teacher who really promulgated the idea of teaching at the bedside. He was a remarkable clinical investigator and an extraordinary human being. Unfortunately, 2 years after becoming the chair of medicine, he died suddenly from a ruptured aneurysm of the brain, a diagnosis he reportedly established on himself. But he had a profound influence on many who subsequently went on to become leaders of the next generation of academic physicians, particularly in the second half of the 20th century. Time doesn't permit to talk about all of them, but I'm going to show you two. The first was Gene Stead. So Gene Stead was one of the senior residents in that group, and when shortly after Soma Weiss passed away, Dr. Stead moved to Emory and then ultimately to Duke, where he spent the bulk of his academic career. And here's Dr. Stead teaching at the bedside, just as Soma Weiss had taught him. And Dr. Stead took with him, when he went to Emory, half a dozen of the most remarkable people like Jim Hickam and Jim Warren and Paul Beeson and Jack Myers. And that's where the story links to me. So Jack Myers was with Gene Stead until 1950, when he moved to Pittsburgh to become the chairman of the Department of Medicine there. And from 1950 to 1970, he was the chair there. And during my medical school years, I became familiar with Dr. Myers. He was well known by students and by house officers alike for what was sometimes referred to as a thorough teaching style. After giving up the medicine chair, he became a pioneer in medical informatics. He recognized the power that computers had, both for the teaching of medicine and for the care of patients, and was really one of the pioneers in that whole area. But my interaction with Dr. Myers began when I was a senior medical student. At that time, we had our entire year elective, and I spent 6 months in a renal physiology lab and 3 months on a hematology rotation, but I had the agreement of my mentors that from 10 to 12 every day, I could go and make rounds with Dr. Myers. Wherever he was making rounds, I would go. Now, all of my friends thought I was absolutely nuts, putting myself in the line of fire every day. They thought I was crazy. But those 2 hours every day for 9 months profoundly influenced the physician I became, the teacher I became, and the mentor I became. And when I decided to pursue a career in internal medicine, I met with Dr. Myers in his office, and I said, Dr. Myers, where should I go to interview? He said, there's really only one place to go. And he said, that's Duke. I said, say what? And he said, yeah, and he pointed to a picture above his desk, which had 20 people along with Soma Weiss, and he introduced me to all of them. 18 of them, by the way, had gone on to become chairs of medicine later on. But he pointed out Dr. Stead, who was the tall guy in the back, and he said, Dr. Stead runs the best training program in the country. You must go there. So I agreed, and I certainly wouldn't not go there, but I looked at the map and I saw I was 8 miles from Chapel Hill, and I decided as long as I'm going to Durham, I might as well go to Chapel Hill, because I'd been to Ann Arbor. I loved Ann Arbor. In fact, I thought I was always going to end up in Ann Arbor, and I thought Chapel Hill might be like Ann Arbor as a college town. So I spent Tuesday in Durham, and I met with a fellow named Andy Wallace and a bunch of other people, and they were all very enthusiastic. And then I had lunch with the house officers, and that was different. They weren't very enthusiastic. They weren't very happy. They felt put upon. One of them fell asleep into his grits, I think. And they told me about working 5 nights out of 7 and how difficult the whole experience was. So I was a little ambivalent when I left there. And then I came to Chapel Hill. And I had the unbelievably good fortune, just by chance, this guy interviewed me. And I didn't know him from Adam. But after an hour and a half, I said, this has to be the best place in the world because this is the best person I've ever met. And the rest of it is history. So that's how I ended up in Chapel Hill. Soma Weiss influenced Gene Stead, who influenced Jack Myers, who sent me to Durham. Maybe I should have put Durham in here, but anyway, ultimately, I had the good sense to come to Chapel Hill. And that's how I got here. So now I'm going to tell you the story of each decade. And the first decade, of course, was my decade as a trainee. And this was the Department of Medicine house staff in those days. I know Joe Russell and some of the others here will recognize a few of the people here. I hope some of them are here. I know that Al Brigham is back there. Jim Bryan is back there somewhere. Who else is here? Gene Bozimski is here. Bill Wood. So I hope some of those folks. John Arian. There's John. Yeah, I saw John. So we could fit on the steps of the School of Public Health over there. They could fit there. Today we have divisions that are bigger than this, so our school has grown some. But I'm going to focus my particular attention first on the fellow in the center, who I'm sure many of you know, was Louis G. Welt. So Dr. Welt was the chairman of medicine when I arrived here. He was the chairman of medicine, but he's actually an internationally known nephrologist who came to Chapel Hill, having been recruited by Dr. Burnett, the first chairman of the Department of Medicine, soon after it became a 4-year school. And Dr. Welt had a profound impact on all of us who were his house officers. And I have to tell you one Lou Welt story. There's 100 of them, but I can't tell them all. But when there was a time when we were having trouble getting our results back from the laboratory in a timely manner. We used to call those stat results, but they were not stat, they were slow results. And so a bunch of us, probably Joe and Phil Blatt, who's here, complained to Dr. Welt. So he decided, by God, he'd get to the bottom of that. And so Monday morning, we had morning report, and Dr. Welt said, who needed some stat results last night? So we all raised our hands, and he called on each of us and wanted to know why we needed the results so quickly, and it became a bit difficult. Well, Tuesday, he said, who needed stat results? Well, about 3 people raised their hands. They were the ones who hadn't been there the day before, and we didn't warn them. So Wednesday he said, who needs stat results? Nobody. And he had obviously made his case, and that was Lou. Unfortunately, Lou died 2 years after he went to Yale, very suddenly. But this was a quote that I extracted from his eulogy that was delivered by Neil Bricker, another nephrologist. And it says, and I quote, to his house staff, he was broadly knowledgeable and rigorous in setting the standards of excellence, which he then met himself and expected others to meet. He was also a friend to whom we, the house officers, could turn when we found the whole world of the intern or resident too hostile, too confusing, or simply too overwhelming. And I think that really put Lou's history for us very much in perspective. Now here's another fella that I need to tell you a story or two about. And he's here in the room too. This is Fred Sparling. Fred was also the chair of medicine from 1989 to 1999, but Fred arrived here in Chapel Hill virtually the same day that I did, in the summer of 1969. He was another successful recruitment of John Parker, I believe, because I know he and John were house officers together at the General. And when he came here and John told him this is a really good place, it's at least reported that Fred said, that was enough for me, I'm coming. And the rest is history. And of course, Fred's been very successful here. He was a fantastic teacher, a wonderful clinician, a superb researcher, and a very close friend. And I have to tell one story. The whole idea behind this talk is stories, so I hope you'll indulge me. Fred was the attending one year, when I was an intern, on what was called the private service. And many of you don't remember the private service, but that was up on 6 East. And I remember we made rounds. We'd sit out on the porch there, right, Fred? We had to bring sunglasses to rounds and stuff. But anyway, Fred told us one morning that he was about to fly to Seattle, where he was going to take internal medicine boards. And I said, well, Fred, I can help you with that. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, I'm sure that Dr. Myers is going to be there to greet you, and I think you would be very wise to tell him, Dr. Myers, it's so great to meet you. I have one of your former students who's my intern and is frankly among the best interns I've ever known. Fred chortled and looked at me a little askance. So he got to Seattle, and the next day he gets up and he goes to the testing center. Jack Myers, good to meet you, Fred. Well, Dr. Myers, it's so good to meet you. I have one of your former medical students who's an intern with me in Chapel Hill, and he's absolutely outstanding. Fred got through internal medicine boards. The rest is history. I leave it to you to decide how he got through it. So here's another person who made a big impact on my life. This is a fellow named Phil Blatt, and Phil is here tonight as well. Phil and I were interns together in what was then the old Gravely building in the summer of 1969. And to this day, we've remained among the best of friends. And I can't tell you, you don't make many friends who you're friends with for your life. And having Phil as a friend has been unbelievably important to me. Phil is also among the very best physicians I've ever known. He's unbelievably smart about patient care, particularly hematology. Phil left the faculty. He and I were interns together, residents together, fellows together, and junior faculty together, and we refer to ourselves as the Indians. We were the two Indians. Everybody else in our division were chiefs. And you can imagine what went downhill. But anyway, Phil left in 1982, I believe, to join a private practice in Wilmington, Delaware, of hematology. But we remained close friends ever since. And he's back in the area now, which I'm really happy about. But it's interesting that even though Phil left, the Department of Pathology continues each year to give the Phil Blatt Award to that person in their department who demonstrates the best and most important excellence in the teaching of laboratory medicine. So I think that tells a little bit about Phil's impact, even though he's left Chapel Hill. But obviously I need to get to John Parker, who was a big part of my life. So John, when I decided that I was going to do hematology as a career, John strongly encouraged me to go to the best places in the country. You should go to Seattle and see Clem Finch. Go to Utah, meet Max Wintrobe. Go to WashU, meet Carl Moore. And so I went to all these places, and I got offered jobs at all of them, but it wasn't the same. And my decision to stay at UNC really was driven by the chance to work in John's lab under his mentorship. And I haven't regretted it a day since. John was a red cell physiologist who studied dog red cells, of all things. Dog red cells are very bizarre. They have too much sodium, very little potassium. They're among the only cells in the animal kingdom like that. They don't even have a sodium-potassium pump. And John loved these cells and was forever trying to figure out how they maintain their volume. Well, both he and I together decided that while he could be a basic scientist and stuff, I couldn't do that. I needed to study some type of human disease, and so we ultimately decided that sickle cell disease was the perfect disease for me to study. First of all, because the principles of cell volume regulation were very much applicable to the sickle red cell. And second of all, because in 1972, the Sickle Cell Anemia Control Act had been signed into law by President Nixon, creating the sickle cell branch at the NIH, and mandating that a substantial amount of funds would be devoted specifically to research grants and to create the Sickle Cell Centers program. And so promptly I wrote my first grant, a Research Career Development Award. Now we would probably call that a K08 grant, and my first R01, and they were both funded likely because they had a lot of money, not because I was so great. But the bottom line is that it really was a good decision, because not only was I able to build a research program, but we were able to establish a clinical program that was badly needed. There were lots and lots of patients with sickle cell disease who came here, but nobody really cared about them. And so they'd come here and they'd see one physician and go to the emergency room and go to the ward and then go home, and they'd go through the same process over and over again. And we decided we could create a program that would care for these patients. And furthermore, we felt that the clinical program and the research program would mutually support one another. So that then got me to the next decade, which is the sickle cell years. And here's a few pictures of people who've had a big impact on that program over the past 2 or 3 decades, and I'll just point them out. So this is Rupa Redding-Lollinger, who's here. Rupa was a trainee, actually, of mine at one time, who then became largely a pediatric hematologist, and she and I were able to put a program together that took care of both children and adults together, and we thought that was a really important thing to do. Here's Susan Jones, and Susan was our very first research study coordinator and still works with us and is terrific. Del Strayhorn was our first physician's extender and played an important role in much of what we did and still do. And finally, Sherry Dresner. So Sherry was a social worker who taught me how important a really good social work could be for this patient population. And finally, I point out Ken Ataga, who's up in the center. Ken was our first fellow. Ken is now graduated and become an attending, and now is tenured and is very well funded and is a member of the ASCI and now directs the sickle cell program that I was delighted to turn over to his capable hands. I want to say a word or two about Wendell Ross, and Wendell is shown here. Wendell was another mentor of mine. Wendell was the chief of hematology at Duke, and he also had become a national figure in the whole sickle cell anemia community. And we had a number of meetings together. He introduced me to Dr. Clarice Reed. He broadened my network, as a good mentor should. And Dr. Reed, the director of the sickle cell branch at the NIH, strongly encouraged us to work together to put together a sickle cell program and ultimately to compete for a comprehensive sickle cell center. And we were successful in doing that. We got the grant funded in 1988 and were able to maintain funding for 20 years. When Wendell retired, Dr. Marilyn Tellen, shown here, and I continued this joint collaboration. And not only that, we kept the center going. We also wrote a number of R01s that joined our programs together. And perhaps most importantly, we were able to convince the state that they should provide support to our medical centers for the clinical aspects of their program so that we could then devote the resources of the center to the research activities. Finally, I'll talk to you briefly about a good friend whose name is Sam Charash. So Sam was a hematologist, a senior hematologist at Johns Hopkins, and he was the real pioneer and founding father behind the hydroxyurea work. So he developed and then led 2 NIH-funded studies that we all wrote together, but he was the leader of. UNC was a major factor in both the phase 1 study and the phase 3 efficacy trial. And Sam was a fantastic mentor. He showed us that 18 academic medical centers could work together, side by side, and do this work together. He also taught us to deal effectively both with the NIH and with Bristol Myers Squibb, which was the drug company that made the drug. And he did this all with a wonderful sense of humor and grace that was truly remarkable. And here are 3 of the papers. The first one I put in because this was John and I, a paper that John and I worked on together, where we took hydroxyurea and we administered it both to humans and to dogs, and we looked at the effect. And that's the only paper that we did where we looked at human cells and dog cells together. Here's the clinical paper, the phase 3 efficacy trial. This is a very short report, and this is a much longer report which had all the data in it that appeared in Medicine. And these papers together were really key factors in the FDA approval that we received for the treatment of hydroxyurea, for the use of hydroxyurea in treatment of sickle cell disease, and to date, it's the only drug commercially available in that setting. And this is a picture that was taken about 6 months ago of at least part of our sickle cell group. So it has grown and really thrived under Ken's leadership. So I got to know the General Clinical Research Center, and for those of you who don't know what a GCRC is, this is a facility that's located in the hospital that provides the resources and the infrastructure for those of us who did human research. So it had inpatient rooms and outpatient exam rooms, it had a research kitchen, it had nurses, it had a computer system, it had all the things you needed to do human research. You couldn't do the studies like we did with hydroxyurea in the hospital. You needed a research facility, and that's what the GCRC was. So I got to know the GCRC, and I liked it a lot. And this decade began and clearly proves that timing was absolutely everything. In about 1988, Dr. Judy Vitakaitis, shown here, then the director of the GCRC program at the NIH, called me up and asked me to join the GCRC study section. I wasn't sure, but I knew one of the people on that study section was a friend of ours named Jim Kushner, a hematologist from Salt Lake City who was here a couple of years ago and gave the Jeff Palmer lectureship. And Jim said, "You should do it. It's a really good thing." So I did. I agreed to do it. 6 months later, Bob Udiger, then the director of the GCRC at UNC, announced his intention to leave UNC and to move to Boston to become an associate editor of the New England Journal. And I knew from that year on the study section and for the site visits I'd made that I knew more about GCRCs than anybody here in Chapel Hill. Maybe even Dr. Udiger. Don't tell him I said that. But anyway, I was absolutely thrilled when Dr. Bondurant, shown here, called me up and said he wanted me to success Dr. Udiger. And of course, the rest is history. So what did I do there? Well, truth be known, the single best thing I did was I convinced a young woman named Ellen Luddington, who's here, I think, with us today, that she should leave the Department of Medicine, where she was the research grants manager, and come with me, and together we'd embark on this big adventure of running the GCRC. She looked at me like I had two heads, but then ultimately she agreed to do it, and it was the best thing that I could have possibly done. Ellen was the most amazingly capable person. You know, I think of an administrator as somebody who balances the books and stuff, but Ellen could do anything. As you'll see, we renovated the whole facility. She was like the general contractor. She knew everybody. She had everybody doing the right things. She was unbelievable. If there was a problem in the kitchen, she'd say, "Hey, Gene, you better go talk to Marjorie because there's a problem." She always knew when to tell me what to do and how to do it, and I'll be forever grateful to Ellen. The next thing we did is we convinced this guy. This is Bob Golden. I don't know if he's here or not. I hope he's here. There he is. There's Dr. Golden. He was at that time a junior faculty member in the Department of Psychiatry, but I wandered over to his office, which was somewhere in the South Wing, and it's an office. It has sofas and stuff like that, and I guess only psychiatrists have offices like that, and I convinced him that he ought to come and help me do this. And together, the two of us, and Ellen and David Clemens and Joe Eron, ran this facility. The other thing that we did is we were convinced that the only way we're going to be successful is if we built a good relationship between the GCRC, the School of Medicine, and the hospital. And I argued that we needed a strong administrator, both from the hospital and the school, who could work with us and do the things that needed to be done. And I had the good fortune to getting David Perry, then the Associate Dean for Administration, and Charles Askew, then the Chief Fiscal Officer of the hospital. And together, we turned this into a great thing. We also were able to recruit an endowment, and this is the Cavanis family, Dr. Vern Cavanis Sr., who was the first internist in Raleigh, but always had a commitment to research, and his son, Vern Jr., who's a pediatric neurologist and neuroscientist at Harvard, together endowed our facility, so it became the Vern S. Cavanis Clinical Research Center, and I became the Vern S. Cavanis Clinical Research Professor or something like that. And when I moved to the Dean's office, I left it for my successor, Paul Watkins, and now it's John Buse, who's here today, and that's the Cavanis family, and we're forever in their debt. Among the things that we did on the GCRC is we renovated the entire facility. You know, when you have a big grant like this, and we'd had it for about 30 years, the NIH was paying the hospital, they paid the hospital money for essentially rent on the space, and they also gave them depreciation costs. But as far as I could tell, those depreciation costs basically went into the pocket of Charles Askew and Mr. Munson, et cetera, and I argued that the place was now depreciated and we now needed to invest in it. And they did, and they were great about it. And we turned out to have the best physical facility in the country. We also made a great deal. It was a win-win. We had too many beds. We had 22 beds. We didn't need nearly that many beds. We needed more outpatient exam rooms. So I was able to make a deal with the hospital. I gave them beds, which then they could use for inpatients, and they gave me rooms, and we renovated them to outpatient exam rooms. We also recruited investigators all over the campus and ultimately wrote the first renewal on which we got a score of 121, which was the best score that anybody could ever remember a GCRC having received. We also, this is a good story, so we also spared no expense. We had a holiday party every holiday around Christmas, and we spared no expense. We brought in that well-known rock group, 3 Live Crew. Of course, I never quite figured out why it was called 3 Live Crew, and there were actually 4 of us, but nevertheless, it included David Clemens. This is, by the way, the reason it's dots, it looks like pointillism, but that's actually because this was from one of our news clippings. Dave Clemens, Joe Eron, myself, and of course the leader of the group was Bob Golden here on keyboard. He wrote the lyrics. He was the only one crazy enough to do most of this stuff. But I want to show you a bit about the importance of this facility and how it functioned. I'm going to show you 2 examples. The first, I'm going to show you a bit about factor VIII concentrates and the role of the GCRC in that. And then I'm going to show you its role in the growth hormone IGF-1 axis. And here are a few of the key people from the Hemophilia Center who played an important role in the development of factor VIII concentrates. And I'm so glad to see my friend Harold Roberts here in the audience and shown in his picture here. And here's a paper that he and Dr. Webster and Dr. Brinkhouse published in a journal called the American Journal of Medical Sciences. And I have a brief clip. I thought rather than me explain it to you, I'd have one of your friends present this to you. And so...
Well, we were very fortunate to have a center with laboratory support and so on for doing this. These were experimental concentrates compared to plasma. They were very potent compared to anything that had been available before. And, it was just astounding to see that you could elevate the missing protein from absent to levels even twice the normal. And this was a tremendous step forward. It was really the beginning of the modern therapy of chemotherapy replacement therapy.
So I thought you'd all enjoy seeing Dr. Brinkhouse. So that was good. We had concentrates. We could raise the factor levels very high, but there was a problem. You had to take sample plasma from thousands and thousands of people to pool it to make these concentrates. And very quickly, we're finding infections, finding hepatitis. Once upon a time, I think we called it non-A, non-B hepatitis. Turned out to be C hepatitis. But also, we were finding here the frequent detection and isolation of cytopathic retroviruses from patients with AIDS and risk for AIDS. And this paper, which was published in Science by Dr. Gallo and others, also included the group from UNC. You can see here's Gil White and Paul Foster. The reason they're on it is because this was from their patient, okay? And so it was clear they had to do something different. And this led, I hope, to the use of recombinant DNA technology to make anti-hemophiliac factor for the treatment of patients with classical hemophilia. And I'm going to let another friend describe this.
Recombinant factor VIII was first tested here in the clinical research unit. Actually, it was the first test anywhere in the world in March of 1987. I think recombinant factor VIII has several advantages over plasma-derived factor VIII. First, since it's not made from human plasma, it does not have the capacity of transmitting some of the blood-borne viruses that have characterized plasma factor VIII concentrates. You can actually manufacture the factor VIII and make as much factor VIII as you want. You're not limited by the number of donors that have to come in and give material.
So, and Gil is here with us tonight too, which I'm thrilled about. I just want to say a word or two about this crowd. So this included Dr. Van Wyck, a former Berryhill lecturer, Lou Underwood, and David Clemens, and they used the GCRC, and they used a human model, a human, accident of nature, genetic abnormality, to help them unlock the keys to the growth hormone IGF-1 axis. So here's Lou measuring this little guy. This little guy was about 8 or 10 years old, and he was the size of about a 3-year-old. He was very short, and for all the world, he looked like he was growth hormone deficient. But he wasn't. His growth hormone levels were very high. What was wrong? Well, here turned out to be the key. So growth hormone is secreted by the pituitary gland, and it circulates to the liver. Here in the liver, it binds to its receptor and then releases a number of things, including insulin-like growth factor, or IGF-1. IGF-1 then acts on the target tissues to promote growth. And what they found is that although this little guy's growth hormone levels were high, his IGF-1 levels were low, and it turned out the problem was a defect in the growth hormone receptor. It couldn't bind the growth hormone, and therefore it couldn't release IGF-1. So what did they do? They gave infusions of IGF-1 to these little guys, and they very promptly started to grow and catch up. So that was the story, and of course this was all done in the Clinical Research Center of the University of North Carolina, et cetera. So those were a couple examples of how the GCRC played an important role. But I also want to tell you one other thing that the GCRC did. It taught me about my passion for and commitment to young people. I've always felt that young people were important to an academic medical center. In fact, I thought if you don't have a whole population of good young people, the school's inevitably going to fail. And during the 10 years that I spent directing the GCRC, I really learned not only how important it was, but how much I loved trying to do that. And I'm going to show you 2 examples that occurred to me. The MD-PhD program and what's called the CAP program. So first the MD-PhD program, and here's a picture of a friend, Mike Simmons. I hope Mike is here. You here, Mike? Not here. Yeah, I hope he's coming. Anyway, the MD-PhD program, we've always had one for many years. The problem is it was never very substantial. The institution really never invested the resources in it that you need. And so it could never compete for what's called a Medical Scientist Training Program, or MSTP grant. And if you don't have an MSTP grant, you're never going to get the best students, because they all go to their undergraduate advisors and they look on the website. And if you're not listed there with the other 30 or 40 places, you might as well forget it. So Mike said to me, he wanted me to do this. He knew I could do it well. He knew I'd compete for an MSTP grant, et cetera. Well, I was very ambivalent about all this. You know, but what happened is I learned that Mike could be very persuasive, and he wouldn't take no for an answer. And after about 3 or 4 months, I gave up and I said, okay, Mike. And I made some what I thought were outrageous demands. And he said, sure, fine. I said, oh, Christ, now I got to do it. But, you know, it turned out to be one of the best things I ever did in my life, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. The other thing is the so-called Clinical Associate Physician, or CAP program. So CAP awards are grants that are made through the GCRC program that I learned about when I was on the study section there, and I recognized that, man, this was easy. This is like shooting fish in a barrel. And so we ended up with more CAP awardees than all the other places in the country put together practically. Here's just a small list of a few of them. Bill Miller, David Wall, Lisa Carey, they're all here on the faculty. Lisa just became my boss, among other things. Bill Blackstock is the chair of radiation oncology at Wake Forest. John Worstelman is the director of research at GSK in the Park, and there's a whole bunch of others. So I learned from these 2 things that I was going to spend the last decade in the dean's office doing something about young people. So this is my friend Dr. Haupt sitting here in the front row. He had a lot more hair than this when he asked me to do this. I think the years in the dean's office put a few years on him. But anyway, soon after his arrival, it's fun, we'd had dinner together during his recruitment, and we sort of hit it off. And he wasn't here 3 or 4 months, and he had his secretary page me. And, you know, getting a page to the dean's office is not what you expect in the early morning. And so I said to him, what does he want? Well, he just wants to see you. Oh, geez. So I went to see him, and what he told me is he wanted me to become his executive associate dean for faculty affairs. So first I made a couple of off-color remarks, and I said, what are you talking about, Jeff? He said, well, like promotion and tenure, and so that really sounds interesting. And I rolled my eyes and said, now, Jeff, if we were talking about faculty development, I might be interested. So I told him I thought there was going to be a lot of grants that we could compete for, and I bet we could grow our whole junior faculty, et cetera. And so we ultimately talked about it. He said, well, why don't you do both? I said, well, will you pay me twice as much? And he said, no. But anyway, so I said I'd have to think about it. And I did think about it for a while. And I said, why would I want to move to the dean's office? I said, well, number one, I'd run the GCRC for about 10 years, and I'd done pretty well. But I felt I'd probably used up most of my good ideas, and it was a reasonable time to make a change. Second of all, I know that I've always enjoyed growing programs, building programs, and developing them. I like doing that. And finally, I saw this as a potential opportunity to do things with young people for the last decade of my career. So I came back and I said, okay, Jeff, I'll do it. I'll become your associate dean for faculty affairs and faculty development, but you need to understand I'm going to be a weird kind of dean because I'm going to sit there and write grants most of the time. And he looked at me like I was crazy, but he said, okay. And sure enough, he provided support to Bill Marsloff and I, and we created this little office we called the Office of Research and Faculty Development, and it included people like Dee Dee Corvinus and Trish Burns and a number of others, and this became a very successful enterprise. In the dean's office, I had so many people, I can't recognize all of them, but I just want to mention a few. I mentioned Jeff Haupt already. Jeff was a wonderful mentor and friend. I enjoyed our time together immensely. I have Bob Blue in here, and partly to be representing all the deans of all the other schools on the Health Affairs campus, because as Bill said earlier, I really felt it was important to not just support our students, but to grow students all across the Health Affairs campus. Now, not everybody agreed with me, but I thought it was the right thing to do, just like I learned from Roger. If you do the right thing, it always works out. And sure enough, and you'll see some of the data, that we supported people all across the campus, and we were quite successful. Dave Perry, again, was the Associate Dean for Administration and taught me more than I could possibly recount about being a dean. Jimmy Anderson, I put him here to represent the 15 or so chairs and center directors that we recruited during that time. Jim was a fantastic friend, and he came from Yale, where he was a gastroenterologist, to run our physiology division. And he's now gone to the NIH, where he works in Francis's office, and we miss him a lot. And I think sometimes he wishes he was back, from what I gather, but he's doing great, and he's fantastic. When Jeff stepped down and Bill became the dean, he had a different model, and he had vice deans. First, Bob Golden, and when he told me Bob Golden was going to be his vice dean and I was going to report to Bob Golden, that was like dying and going to heaven. I mean, Bob was like my closest friend, and we were thrilled about that. And Bob spent 2 years in that role, and then was beginning to get offers of his own deanships, and finally chose to go to Wisconsin. You can see he's got this red sweater on, or sweatshirt, and he's doing great up there, and I miss him a lot, and I get up there to see him periodically. And he was replaced by another really close friend, and that's Etta Pisano. And Etta is doing fantastically well. She spent a couple of years in the job here and then went to Charleston. And we miss both of them here immensely, but we're also enormously proud of their accomplishments. I have to say a good word about Jennifer Nall, who's here in the room. Jennifer, so I have to tell the story, and it involves Stuart Bondurant's significantly better half. Her name is Susan Eringhouse. And Susan left UNC about 10 or 12 years ago, and when she was leaving, she called me on the phone, and she said she was leaving, and she was leaving in Chapel Hill, the best administrative assistant she'd ever had. Did I know anybody for whom she could work? And I said, Susan, say no more. You've said enough. And the rest is history. And Jennifer and I spent about 7 or 8 years together, and it was some of the happiest times of my life. Jennifer was the best administrative assistant. You can't imagine how good she was. And when we did all these chair recruitments and stuff, the biggest problem I had was each of the chairs that I recruit would try to recruit Jennifer away. So I had to tell them, no, that's not in the cards. That's not possible. And I fended everybody off until Etta finally convinced her to go to Charleston with her, and I'm sure it was the best thing that Etta ever did. And when she left, Carol Carol Edenton replaced her, and we worked together for a year and a half or 2 years, and Carol was fantastic as well. And filling the shoes of Jennifer was a real challenge, and so I can tell you that Carol was great. So I just list here a few of the things that I did in the dean's office. I recruited 15 chairs and center directors with Jeff. I rewrote the promotion and tenure policy to something readable and understandable, and I think it's pretty decent. We did everything we could to enhance the status of non-tenure track faculty. During our tenure in the dean's office, the size of the non-tenure track faculty went up dramatically, and the size of the tenure track faculty stayed the same or even went down a little bit. And you had to be sure that they understood that they were valued. And I can promise you that some of the non-tenure track faculty were our most important faculty members, and some of the tenure track faculty, if they left, you'd probably say, don't slam the door when you go. So the people are important, not the titles. We developed this post-tenure review process that was mandated by the Board of Governors, and which taught me how really good so many of our senior faculty are. And finally, we wrote lots and lots of grants, and I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking a little bit about this. So these are 4 of the grants, for only a small number of the large number of grants we wrote, but these are really important ones. These are all what are called K Awards, and K Awards are relevant to the training of young people. The K30 was the clinical research curriculum, and we used the funds from that to fund the faculty who then taught our junior faculty how to do clinical and translational research. And these K-12 grants all contain funds, lots of funds, to support junior faculty. One of the key points to make is that UNC is the only institution in the country that had all 4 of these grants. And they had them because we had an office that was going to write these grants. But together, they helped us build this training program for junior faculty, particularly those committed to clinical and translational research, to establish a master's degree program in clinical research, and to identify and then provide support for the best faculty we could find, these junior faculty, drawn from all across the health affairs campus. And let me show you, this is when I came to the dean's office. We were supporting basically nobody. And 10 years later, we were supporting 45 junior faculty members. And again, they were from all across the campus. These grants also set us up very well for the Clinical and Translational Science Award that Bill mentioned. Because we had these grants, the size of your CTSA is dependent upon the number of those K-12 grants and the size of your GCRC. And since ours were all quite big, we got $12.5 million a year. I'll put it in perspective. Our peer institutions, Stanford, $6 million a year. Ohio State, $5.5 million a year. So those are the kinds of schools that we were competing with, and we did extremely well. A key component of the CTSA is our Education, Training, Career Development Core, and it's directed by myself and a fellow named Morris Weinberger, who's here with us. And together, he and I not only are funding the things that are running the things that were funded by the CTSA, but we've brought a lot of other programs under the umbrella of the Education Core. So here are a few of the people in the Education Core. Here's Morris and myself, and here's Susan Pusek. So we're called the directors, but if you want to know who's irreplaceable, it's Susan. Susan is without doubt among the best people I've ever known in managing and running programs like this, and we're incredibly fortunate to have her with us. We also have a group of statisticians, epidemiologists, and senior faculty, and we have lots of others. These are just representative people, but I particularly want to highlight 3 people here. These are people who started out as trainees and are now part of our faculty. So one of the ideas and one of our key, I forget what we call them exactly, but we have 5 key principles, and the 5th principle is that everything we do is a two-way street. That is, we're going to support the heck out of you, and we're going to fund you, and we're going to help you write your grants, and we're going to review your grants, et cetera. But we also expect you to give back by mentoring other people, by reviewing grants, by participating in our programs. And these are 3 of the best examples of giving back to the program. Here's our CTSA Education Core. The 5 programs in the center are funded with money from the CTSA, but the others all around the periphery are funded with other mechanisms, but are just as important, and we run them as part of our core. Time doesn't permit to talk about all of them, but I'm going to talk about 2. I'm going to talk about the MD PhD program, and I'm going to talk about the Birch program for a few minutes. So here's the MD PhD program, and this is the growth. So this is when I started. There were 12 people. It was hard to call it a program because they didn't even know each other. And today we have 75 people, and they know one another very well. They're fantastic kids, and I'll say a bit more about them in a few minutes. Here they are. In fact, this was our retreat. We have an annual retreat. When we had our first retreat, we had it around a small table. We don't have a table that will fit all of us together. This is at the Blockade Runway at Wrightsville Beach. And this is an understatement because here's the 9 people who just graduated this spring and went off to the best training programs in the country, and we miss them all. Now, I want to just say a word about this. We've created teams in our MD PhD program, and these teams are created for a number of reasons. First of all, we want to have vertical integration. So each team has representatives each year in the program, first-year students, second-year students, third-year students, et cetera. And the purpose of that is that they can form another layer of mentoring. So the upper-level students mentor the lower-level students. They also have a couple of my KL2 scholars as representatives on the team. And among the things I expect the teams to do is to do some kind of community service activity through the year. I learned that from Francis. Remember, Francis taught me that it's good to be altruistic. And so here are 4 examples. The students, in fact, tomorrow again, they go to the food bank drive at the State Fair, and they collect truckloads of canned goods. You can get, if anybody wants to go to the State Fair tomorrow, you take a couple of cans, and you can get in for free. And our students will take the cans from me and put them in the trucks. Here was a 5K fundraiser for pediatric cancer. It was held last Saturday. One of the teams, that's Team Sell Yeah. Here's another team participating in a day cleanup at the Forest Theater. And here's a weekend build at Habitat for Humanity. So our teams are doing really good things. How is the outcomes of our students? I'll show you just a couple of bits of data for that. So we've had 63 graduates between 1999 and the present. Of them, 25 are house officers. You saw the 9 who are first-year house officers. We also have second-year and third-year house officers. We have 13 who are generally research fellows, 22 who are faculty members elsewhere or here. We've got several of them here at UNC. And 3, or less than 5%, have gone into private practice. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with going in private practice. I'm very all for it. But our goal in this program is to train physician scientists, and our hope is that they'll either become academics, they'll end up in industry, or whatever is good. But so far, we're doing pretty well, I think. The other thing, this is what Bill was mentioning, these are the top 20 schools in terms of NIH grant support. Here's the amount of dollars that each of us had in 2011. Here's the number of MD PhD students, and all but Oregon have an MD PhD program. And F30 awards, those are the grants that Bill mentioned, that MD PhD students can write and support them both in grad school and in med school. And you can see that over 35% of our students have these grants. And not only is this number higher, but the percentage is astronomically higher than any of the other institutions. In fact, the only one over 20 is WashU, and they have 3 times as many students as we do. So our kids are doing great. Not only that, we have 4 more at the NIH pending review, and Mohanish Deshmukh is here, held a boot camp for these students today, and 10 students were there. They're learning to write these grants just like their predecessors. So how have we been successful? We've been successful in part because we had terrific leadership. Self-excluded, I've had help from Leslie Parisi, Gil White, who's here, David Sidorovsky, who recently left to become the chair of physiology and pharmacology at West Virginia, and now my lieutenant and substantially better half is Kim Rathmel, and she's been fantastic. But truth be known, the people really responsible for our success are our assistant directors, and these are the people who help to run our program. We call them assistant directors. They're really the administrators, and they're the glue of the program. So Kelly Musty did it for 7 years, and Liz Garman did it for 5 years, and now Allison has been in it for 4 years, and Allison's just fantastic. We're just so lucky to have each of these people. I want to turn in the last couple of minutes to talk about the Birch program. Birch is an acronym for Building Interdisciplinary Research Careers in Women's Health. Women's health is something I don't know very much about, but I'm really good at writing these grants. And so we got funded among the first cadre of Birch programs, and we got refunded the second time, and we got funded the third time. In fact, we got a perfect 10 on the third renewal. And because this is the longest running of our K-12 programs, the data are most mature, and so I thought I'd show you a little of the data from them. Here's one of our former scholars, who's now the director of our program, and that's Kim Bogus, and Kim is here somewhere. But here are the demographics. So we've had 32 scholars in the program. It's not a women's program, it's a women's health program, but not surprisingly, 30 of our 32 scholars have been women. They came with MDs or PhDs, combined degrees, a variety of programs from medicine, pharmacy, nursing, public health, social work. 25 are currently on the faculty here at UNC, and 7 have been recruited away, but we've created a whole new cadre, a whole new population of women's health researchers. Here's their pictures, and they're great, and I could go through this and you'd see how diverse they really are. But here's their outcomes. So we've had a total of 32 Birch awardees. All 32 remain in academia. All 32 are doing women's health research. 3 are current scholars, 29 have graduated, 27 out of 29 have their own research support, 25 have their own NIH grant. They're the PI on at least one of their own. Together, if you look at them, they have over 80 NIH grants and well over $100 million in grant support. This has been a very successful program, obviously. This leads me to my epilogue. So I'm almost over, and bear with me for another couple minutes. What I want to do here is to recognize my mentees. So these are the 134 students who were my MD, PhD students from 1995 to the present. I think some of you guys are here. Are some of you here back there? Stand up. Stand up. Come on, stand up, you guys. Stand up. Stand up. All right. See. Don't sit down. I want you to stay standing. I want to see if I get most of the room standing. These are the 58 K-12 and KL2 scholars. Hope some of you are here. Stand up if you're here. All right. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. Don't sit down. How about Birch? Where are Birch scholars? Hey, there's my Birch scholars. Yes. And then Simmons scholars. I hope there's some Simmons scholars here. There's one. There's another. Yeah. I didn't say much about the Simmons Scholar Program, but I should. This is a program that Mike Simmons envisioned when he was the dean, and he's funded with 1% dollars, and it's been a terrific program, and it's allowed us to expand the diversity of our school considerably, and it's a wonderful thing. And the Simmons Scholars themselves voted to change the name from the Minority Scholar Program to the Simmons Scholar Program about 6 or 8 years ago, and I'm very happy about that. So what I've tried to show you is sort of the power of mentoring, that I had a few mentors, and they impacted me, and I've now tried to expand that and provide that to as many of the people as you saw in the back of the room. Finally, I just want to close by dedicating this lecture. So it is my great pleasure to dedicate this lecture to John Parker. Soon after I arrived in Chapel Hill, he became my mentor, my role model, and my friend. As a clinician, a teacher, and a scientist, he was unparalleled, an absolute triple threat. He set the bar in each area at such an incredibly high level, it was almost impossible to match. His effect on all aspects of my career, indeed on my life, cannot be overstated. It was absolutely profound. And what I would argue is not only his effect on me, but it was indirectly on all the people you saw standing before. So my last slide is here, and I read, in front of the Gravely building, there stood a beautiful cherry tree. This tree had been planted by the 1993 Medicine House staff in memory of John Parker. And here's the plaque that was under that tree. It was planted in honor of John. Both the tree and the building are now gone, but John's memory lives on in the many of us whose lives he impacted so greatly, either directly or indirectly. And this is a sharp-shinned hawk. Now, don't ask me where I got this picture, but what I will ask you is, does anyone here believe in reincarnation? Thank you.